Disclaimer. J.K. Rowling's eyes bore into your soul.
Okay, Hermione said as she stared into the mirror. Here it goes.
She took a deep breath, waved her wand, and incanted,
Hominem Revelio.
She felt a wave of magic pass over her. It wasn't strong, but she had a distinct sense of something swooping down on her. Ominous. She saw a pale aura appear around her reflection, just as it was supposed to. That one obviously worked. Now for the real test. She waved her wand in a different pattern, and carefully enunciated, Atma Prakata. The feeling of this spell was different. Rather than a spirit swooping down, it resembled the feeling of a pair of penetrating eyes on her, the kind that seemed to bore into one's soul, like Dumbledore at his best. It made her feel very self-conscious, and all the more so since it was as if she were staring into her own soul herself. The aura that appeared around her reflection was brighter this time, and it wasn't white, but a very familiar mix of colors. A mix of silver and blue swirling in and around her. Slowly she drew her red oak wand and cast an unshaped stream of sparks with it. Exactly the same colors.
Interesting,
she said to herself.
It seems to be working.
Hermione's soul detection charm was ready. With extra hints she'd got from Septima, she'd been able to complete the construction, and after some trial and error, she was pretty sure she had a version that worked. It was deceptively simple. Wizards already had a clue with the human presence detection charm and various magic revealing charms. It was just a matter of refining them. She bounded down the stairs from her loft to the bedrooms the boys had set up for themselves before she remembered it was midnight, and she wound up with a startled Harry pointing his wand in her face.
Sorry, she squeaked. I didn't mean to wake you.
Merlin, Hermione, don't do that, Harry groaned, rubbing his eyes. What are you doing up this late?
I was working. I just finished for the night.
Oi, what's the hubbub? George said, stumbling from the twins' room with Fred behind him. You stay up too late again, Hermione?
It's not that late, she mumbled.
Technically it's early, her boyfriend said, coming closer and hugging her from behind. I'd say that qualifies as too late. Hermione half-heartedly fought him.
Well, I was nearly done with the spell I was working on, she said. I didn't want to go to bed in the middle of it.
George shook his head. And knowing you, I'd bet you'd been nearly done for at least the past hour. Hermione turned red. It had been nearly 2. It could have waited till morning, he said.
She said, not dignifying that with a response. It doesn't matter, because I finished my soul detection charm. Look.
She pulled away from George and waved her wand over herself, saying,
Atma Prakata.
The blue and silver aura returned again. Whoa, snazzy, Fred spoke up. So we're getting a look at your soul there?
A representation of it, I guess. Oh, I should check. What color sparks do you make with your wands?
Whatever color we want, said Fred. Yeah, have you seen our fireworks? George added.
No, I mean when you first got them.
Oh, mostly orange, he said. Matched our hair pretty well, said Fred. Why?
Because I'm pretty sure these auras show up in the same color.
She cast the spell on each of the twins in turn, and they shivered under its effect. For both of them the dominant color did, indeed, match their hair, but there were subtle differences. Fred's aura had large swirls of white mixed in, and the orange part had flickers of red and yellow that made it look like a flame. George's aura was more subdued, with small swirls of brown and gray and flecks of bright blue that matched her own blue streaks. Whoa, that's creepy, Fred said. How'd you pack the feeling of Mum calling us out for a prank into a spell like that?
It does lay your soul bare, in a sense, Hermione said. I had to make it go into a lot more detail than an ordinary presence-detecting spell to make it able to detect Horcruxes. It's understandable that it would make you uncomfortable.
George pulled her closer and kissed her. Well, if it's matching wand colors, it must be doing something, he said. It looks like you've got it. Harry shifted his feet uncomfortably. So, if you cast it on me, he said.
It should show the Horcrux, yes, Hermione said soberly. Do you want to see it? We don't have to do it now, but I'll probably have to eventually.
No, just get it over with, he said.
All right, then. She pointed her wand at Harry and said, Atmurk Percata.
Hermione, George, and Fred gasped and recoiled in horror when they saw it. It wasn't from the visual image. Rather, it was from the visceral sense of wrongness that surrounded him. The sort of feeling that seemed to accompany truly dark magic. Hermione suspected most wizards never came into contact with enough dark magic of this caliber to notice, but the pattern was plain as day. Objectively, all she saw was swirls of color around Harry, but she was hit with the emotional impact as if she were seeing her best friend with a deep, gangrenous wound in his head. Harry's aura was a bright, roiling red and gold, blazing like fire and full of life. Not the Gryffindor house colors, but the exact hues of fox plumage when he was in Dumbledore's office. There was another color, too. Unlike a candle flame, which might be blue at its base, Harry's aura contained green. A faint outline of green light was visible, clinging to his skin. But on his head, the colors were marred by an ugly black scar that seemed to penetrate into his skull. The spectral scar was larger than his real one and more jagged, a lightning-shaped carving that extended up into his hairline and down below his eyebrow and emitted wisps of black mist around it. The green fringe surrounding the borders of the scar seeming to press in against it, and his right eye, where it drew nearest, glowed a bright green.
Bloody hell,
Fred muttered.
Is it that bad?
Harry said worriedly.
Check the mirror,
Hermione said in a haunted tone. She maintained the spell while Harry stepped into the bathroom and looked in the mirror.
Ah, hell!
He shouted, jumping back against the wall.
Turn it off!
Hermione put her wand down and the glow vanished. Harry looked like he might be sick, but he kept it together, leaning over the sink with his head in his hands.
That's really been in my head my whole life?
He sputtered.
Since you were 15 months old. Sorry,
Hermione said. She ventured closer to reach out to him, but he smacked her hand away.
Don't touch me, he shouted.
Harry?
No, how can you stand to touch me after that? Because it doesn't change anything. You haven't changed, Harry.
She's got you there, Fred called. You're still the same specky git you always were.
Shut up!
Harry, calm down, Hermione said. He turned to look up at her.
Easy for you to say, Hermione. You're not the one with a piece of you-know-who in your head.
Hermione flinched a little.
But we already knew about that, she said. But seeing it like that...
He coughed and looked like he might be sick again.
I feel defiled.
I understand, she started, but stopped when he glared at her.
Okay, I can't understand, but I can empathize. I told you the spell lays your soul bare. In your case, yours and the Horcruxes. It makes the aura of evil surrounding it impossible to ignore where it's normally hidden. But you saw your own colors, too. You're a good person, Harry, and the Horcrux is so well contained that it's not affected you at all, let alone us.
How can you know that? He demanded.
'Cause if it did, you'd have turned evil years ago, mate, George piped up.
Harry was silent for a minute. When he didn't respond, Hermione tried again.
He's right, you know. You know what the diary did to Ginny when she had it. You saw how the ring made Dumbledore touch it even though he knew it was evil. If that Horcrux was influencing you, we would have noticed it a long time ago.
He sighed and lowered his head.
But what about getting it out?
He mumbled.
I'm going to try.
Do you really think you can do that? He grumbled.
Well, I can actually see it now, she said. That's a good sign.
Hey, buck up, Harry, Fred said, giving him a shove in the shoulder. You're not allowed to start moping around." "Get off," he grunted. The twins picked him up by his arms and carried him to the makeshift dining room. Harry fought, but he started to cheer up soon enough. "You've got to trust Hermione," George agreed. "If anyone can outwit you-know-who, it's her." "Fine," he said, smiling a little. I just wish I had some fire whiskey so I could forget what I just saw." Hermione snorted.
"At least you'd have the option. I actually have to do something about it."
"So what's next?" asked George. "You start working on some arcane ritual?"
"Not yet, George. I have some other tests to run. First, we should probably look at one of the other Horcruxes we've got locked up."
After a few minutes' preparation, Hermione unsealed one of her magically welded boxes and levitated out Salazar Slytherin's locket. There was no doubt that was a Horcrux, even without the spell. They could feel the dark aura around it on their own, but with the spell it was 10 times worse. Visually, the Horcrux also looked like nothing more than a cloud of black mist swirling around the locket. The dark feeling it induced, however, was different. This was a piece of a soul in isolation, something not meant to be divided, that had unnaturally been torn to bits, yet still lived. She recoiled from it as if it was something maimed and deformed. It was like seeing a snake cut in half, but both pieces still writhing on the ground.
"Okay, that's all I need to see of that," she said, cutting off the spell quickly. "Let's try a few other things. I probably should have done a few other tests."
She had only tested the spell on humans and Horcruxes so far, so she thought to try a few controls. Rock? No aura. Plant? No aura. Magical artifact? Harry's broom. No aura. Animal? Problem. Hermione tried the spell on a passing squirrel, and she was dismayed to find that it did produce an aura around it. It was pale and ghostly, less substantial than she got from a human, probably even fainter than the light from Hominum Revelio cast on a human, but it was there. Had she got the spell wrong? But the aura was fainter around an animal, not identical. Or was it because it wasn't a magical animal? Fred and George still had a couple of pygmy puffs floating around. Hermione tested one of them and saw the same ghostly aura as she did around the squirrel. Seeing that the light was fainter, though, she had to wonder if she'd missed something with the negative test. She tried all of them again, this time sealing off her room and casting the spell in complete darkness. Rock? No aura. Plant? No aura. Harry's broom? No aura. Animal? As well as they had cleaned the building, there were still mice and cockroaches and the like to be found around there. She found a cockroach and tested it in a dark room. The spell produced a glow around it, faint, barely visible even in pitch black, but still there. Something was definitely wrong. If a cockroach had a soul, she was fundamentally misunderstanding what she was looking at. Could it be that witches and wizards registered differently from everything else? Or was it something more complicated? No, there was nothing for it. She needed to test a muggle. "I don't like you taking over another operation," Kingsley said. "You know you're not supposed to be a combat unit." "Says the man who thinks Hermione is one of our strongest fighters," George pointed out. Kingsley gave him a stern look. "That doesn't change the fact that you have other duties. I don't know all the details of what you're doing here, but I know your research is essential for the war effort, Hermione."
"It's my research that's why I'm doing this," she said. "I need to do some tests on a muggle. Non-invasive, of course," she added, not mentioning that having your soul scanned could feel quite invasive. "This is the easiest way. I could test it on a muggle on the street and confund them, but if my spell is doing what I'm worried it's doing, I'll need a long session with them to work out the bugs. Anyway, it's a simple muggle-born relocation. We'll take the train to Calais and be back in an afternoon."
Harry groaned. "Don't jinx it, Hermione. When is anything we do simple?"
"Getting the school records was pretty simple."
"Harry is right, Hermione," Kingsley said. "We've already had close calls with these relocations, and it's not at all simple to convince Muggle parents of magic without casting any spells."
Okay, I can see that, she admitted. We'll be careful. But I really do need to talk to a muggle who's privy to magic.
Kingsley sighed. If you must. Hermione walked up to the door of the Muggle house with the three boys behind her. It was a typical cookie-cutter house in Maidstone that could have belonged to anyone in the Muggle world. They'd deliberately chosen the address on the list closest to the Eurostar station in Ashford for speed's sake. It was only a 20-mile drive to the station, and from there they could be in Calais in an hour or so. It was dusk, so they would have cover if need be, but they were already prepared with tickets, luggage, and other essentials. She rang the bell, and a minute later a woman opened the door. She was shorter than Hermione and about a decade older, and was clearly taken aback by finding 4 people on her doorstep at dinner time.
May I help you?
She asked hesitantly.
Good evening, ma'am, Hermione said. May I ask, is there a Madeline Clark living here?
Mrs. Clark, presumably, gave an unconscious glance over her shoulder.
Yes, why?
She asked.
Then it is my unfortunate duty to inform you that your family has been found to be the target of a terrorist plot.
What? Mrs. Clark gasped.
But how is this some kind of joke? No, I'm afraid not, Mrs. Clark. But that's absurd. Terrorists? We don't have any connections in government, no family in the military.
Honey, is something wrong? A sandy-haired man came up beside her. Mrs. Clark lowered her voice.
This girl is trying to tell us there are terrorists after us.
Mr. Clark stared at them with a suspicious look. Is this some kind of scam? He demanded. You're not police. They were in street clothes, after all, and the oldest of them were only 19.
No, Mr. Clark, I'm talking about a very different kind of terrorists than you are, Hermione said. I'll have to ask you to bear with me. This is going to be difficult, but I promise I'm telling the truth.
She nodded to the boys who clustered around her, blocking the view from the street, and she knelt down, placing her handbag on the porch. She reached inside, making a show of sticking her arm further in than the bottom ought to be, and to the couple's growing astonishment, she pulled out a 5-foot piece of carved wood, which was revealed to be a polished, stylized broomstick. How? Said an open-mouthed Mr. Clark.
Could I ask you to take a few steps back? Hermione said. This isn't something we want seen in public.
The couple took several uneasy steps back into their living room. Hermione could see a pair of small children crowding behind them with wide eyes. She dropped Harry's firebolt, and its auto-hover charm kicked in so that it gracefully righted itself and hovered at waist height.
This is a magic broomstick, she said, and I'm sorry to say that there are evil wizards after your daughter.
Mr. and Mrs. Clark, though horrified, didn't have any trouble inviting the 4 magicals into their house after that display. They stared at the hovering broom warily, and, with Harry's permission, they touched it and ran their hands all around it, checking for wires. "And how could there be?" Harry insisted. "It's your house." They even tested their weight on it, and were surprised to find that it held. It took a fair amount of convincing for them to accept that little Madeline, a normal-looking 7-year-old girl in strawberry blonde pigtails, was a witch. But this was where it was good to have 2 Muggle-raised magicals there to talk to them. Hermione and Harry recounted to them all the times they had done accidental magic as children, and the Clarks were forced to accept the similarities to incidents they had seen. Privately, Hermione and Harry both resolved to keep an eye on 4-year-old Geoffrey. He was probably too young to do accidental magic, but they knew he could very well be a wizard. Madeline was initially thrilled to be a witch, once she understood what it meant, but her excitement was quickly dampened when Hermione informed them of the evil wizards in the world, and the civil war that was targeting magical children born to normals, like Madeline. The family was in danger, they said, and the options were to confine them in a Fidelis protected safe house, or to get them to France and under the French ministry's protection. Not a sure thing, but you-know-who wouldn't want to provoke another country while he was still putting out brush fires at home. Unsurprisingly, the Clarks chose France.
"You don't need to worry," Hermione assured them. You can pack your bags, drive to the train station in Ashford, and take care of the Eurostar to Calais, and there won't be any trouble. We'll provide you with the means to support yourselves and contact you when it's safe to come back home."
"But if all this is true, why are you going to all this trouble?" Mr. Clark protested. "Why don't you just magic us over there?" Fred fielded that one. "Because the Ministry puts a trace on all magical kids."
"More precisely, from the first time they perform accidental magic until their 17th birthday,"
Hermione clarified. She'd thought it over, and had decided the only way it could work as she understood it was for it to be piggybacked on the magic of the book and quill at Hogwarts on the National Runestone Network. "Right, it doesn't track them everywhere, mind. It just tells when magic is done around them," he said. "So if we use spells to move you, the Death Eaters would know it," George continued. "And the spells can't go across international boundaries. There's treaties and stuff. We have to use Muggle methods they won't notice." Thankfully, they accepted that. This whole thing was an enormous shock to them, but like Hermione's own parents years ago, they found it was surprisingly easy to accept the extraordinary when it was staring them in the face. They began packing their bags feverishly, arguing about what to take as they were told to travel light. Through all of this, though, everyone paid little mind to an increasingly distraught Geoffrey. The little boy didn't fully comprehend what was going on, but he was slowly coming to understand that they would have to leave home, probably for a long time, and he was not happy about it. His mother tried to console him, but she had little luck in stopping him from building up to a full-blown tantrum. "I don't want to go!" the boy bawled helplessly.
"I know, Geoffrey," Mrs. Clark said, crouching down and holding his face. "But we have to go so the bad men don't get us. It'll be okay. It'll be just like a holiday," she said cheerfully.
"No!"
he cried. "Calm down, Geoffrey. You'll like it there. You'll get to see the Eiffel Tower and go to Euro Disney and everything."
"I don't want to go!"
There was a faint buzz in the air, the lights flickered, and a moment later there was a loud slam as every door in the house, external and internal, slammed shut and locked itself. Madeline screamed. Hermione's face turned white as chalk.
"Oh, no," she breathed.
"What?" Mrs. Clark said worriedly.
"Accidental magic. They'll have detected that."
She sprang into action and sprinted to the stairs, shouting,
"Change of plans! We have to leave now! Everyone move!"
Mr. Clark had been locked in the master bedroom. Hermione didn't waste time trying to undo whatever unstructured magic the distraught child had done, and just cast
Atithakula!
The door sheared clean of its hinges with a shower of sparks.
"Miss Granger, what's going on?" Mr. Clark said. "Your son just did magic. We have to get out of here before the bad guys notice."
"What, Geoffrey?"
"Yes!"
She opened her handbag and pointed her wand at the mostly full suitcase.
"Pack!"
The suitcase snapped shut and flew through the air, distorting in impossible ways to fit into her bag.
"The kids' stuff?"
she said. Mr. Clark pointed to another already closed suitcase, and she packed that away as well.
"That'll have to do," she said. "IDs, cash, credit cards, medications?"
"Jennifer's overnight bag, downstairs."
"Good, let's go."
She sprinted back down the stairs to find Mrs. Clark holding an unconscious Geoffrey in her arms with Madeline clinging to her legs.
"What did you do?"
she asked. "Stuffed a fainting fancy in his mouth," Fred said.
"Fred, you've never tested those on anyone younger than 11."
"Half of one," he defended himself. "And I've got the antidote here."
Fine. We have to go."
She summoned the other brooms from her handbag. They had the presence of mind, with Kingsley's help, to bring 4 brooms on this mission, just in case. They couldn't apparate to a more favorable location from here because Harry had never been to Dover to do it, and they couldn't be sure Dobby would be able to get through to them since the Death Eaters could block him. They had to fly for it. 20 miles from Ashford to Dover, and another 20 across the Channel. Half an hour's flight at most, even with the brooms weighed down. It was amazing how much faster things were when you didn't have to worry about roads and train schedules. But even then, would they have enough time? She handed the brooms out, and Harry said, You'll have to split up, one of you with one of us.
You two take the kids.
Hermione pointed at the twins. Us? They said in surprise.
You're the ones with actual experience with the little kids.
When we were 10, they said in unison. But they still took the kids, sitting them in front of them on their brooms and wrapping their long arms around them. They used sticking charms to hold them in place. Mr. and Mrs. Clark hesitated, but joined the remaining two magicals, Mr. Clark with Harry, which was good because he had the most powerful broom to handle the weight, and Mrs. Clark with Hermione. There was a fast rapping knock on the door. "Open up! Police!" Hermione, Harry, and the twins froze and stared at each other. There was absolutely no reason for the police to be here.
"Climb on behind me and hold on," Hermione whispered.
The woman did, surprised to find that the broomstick handle felt like a bicycle seat to sit on, and wrapped her arms around her waist. Hermione pointed at Harry and jabbed her wand at the door. He nodded, getting the message. Hermione silently cast
Calcifrago,
loosening the brickwork around the door.
"Now!"
"Bombarda!"
But the police,"
Mrs. Clark started to say, but there was an almighty bang, and half the front wall was blasted outward, knocking the two probable Death Eaters to the ground.
"Go, go, go!"
someone yelled. Maybe it was all of them. The four broomsticks zoomed out the opening in the wall and into the night air, where they raced away from the house at top speed. There were screams as dark spells whizzed by them, but they went wide. Probably that was when the danger finally sunk in for the family. Hermione could hear the children crying over the howling wind.
Those really were those Death Eater wizards?" Mrs. Clark said hollowly. "I'm afraid so," Hermione answered. "I'm so sorry. I knew it was possible, but accidental magic is so rare I didn't think we had to worry about it." "Geoffrey did that?" she asked in horror. "It wasn't his fault, Mrs. Clark. Young children can't control their magic, and if they try to suppress it, it can hurt them. It would have been one of your children sooner or later. That's why we came to you in the first place. I'm just sorry it didn't work out better."
"Hey guys," Harry yelled. "If I know you know who, they'll be on us again before we hit Dover." "And they might have seen our faces," Fred pointed out. "They must have seen our hair," George added.
"Call for backup!" Hermione shouted back. "This could get bad."
"Backup?" Mrs. Clark asked.
"There are more than the four of us, Mrs. Clark. Listen, I'm going to need my hands free. I want you to put your hands behind mine and keep the broom pointed forwards." Okay," she said. She released her grip from around Hermione's waist and unsteadily took hold of the shaft. When Hermione was sure she wouldn't crash the broom, she let go and tapped out a message to Kingsley on her ring. "Flying Ashford to Dover, DE's here help." "Harry, if they see you," she called.
"If they see any of us," he yelled back. It was true. Even if they hadn't seen him, they'd know whom he'd last been seen with and react accordingly.
"Our best chance is we took them by surprise," George said. "It'll take them time to gather the troops." Not enough time, Hermione thought. Harry motioned for them to fly higher, where they could get fractionally more speed out of the brooms in the thinner air. They were already higher than Hermione had ever flown, maybe even higher than Harry had flown, high enough that she kept an eye out for low-flying aeroplanes. But the threat wasn't above. 2 minutes at most after they flew screaming away from Ashford, a dozen dark-robed figures on brooms rose through the twilit air in front of them, invisible until they were nearly on top of them. Of course, the best way to intercept a broom in flight was to apparate ahead of them and come at them from below. "Scatter!" Harry screamed, and his broom veered off to one side. Hermione followed his lead. For her part, she cast bubblehead charms on herself and Mrs. Clark and steered to climb higher. Green curses flew by them from below, and never had she been so thankful for the poor aiming capability of wands. A device to turn a wand into a sniper weapon. No, she couldn't get distracted. This wasn't sustainable. Her broom was slower with 2 people on it, and she didn't know how high it could fly. She thought about what little she knew about aerial combat. You had to get behind your enemy was about all she could think of.
I don't suppose you know anything about dogfighting?" she asked Mrs. Clark.
"What, me?"
the woman said. Never mind, she thought. She knew a few basic maneuvers by name, but she had no clue how they were used, and she was sure brooms didn't handle at all like jet fighters anyway. "Keep 'em moving, don't give them a stationary target." She weaved back and forth as erratically as she could manage. "Find cover." There were patchy clouds a couple thousand feet above them. If she could reach those... Ah! She reeled as a killing curse flashed past them mere feet away. The feeling of dark magic whooshing by close enough to notice, but not enough to react. Not without practice, anyway.
"Need cover. Nubis minuta."
She turned the broom at an angle and cast her wall of fog over a broad swath of the air parallel to their flight. It wasn't much, but it would hopefully hide their movements for the few seconds she needed. She weaved a bit more and pointed the broom at the nearest cloud.
"Aim there,"
she ordered Mrs. Clark, pointing with her wand. Hermione twitched her wrist to open her spring-loaded buckler against dark curses and looked over her shoulder, readying herself. The Death Eaters emerged from the cloud behind them, and she cast fast. She should have brought some extra carbon for this, but this would have to do. She ran her wand along the edge of her buckler and turned the outer fraction of an inch of the carbon nanotube plates into ultrafine fibers. They were thinner than usual to conserve material, not strong enough to cut someone to ribbons, but strong enough to tangle them up. The fibers spun away like invisible kite string, and she used a charm to aim them at the Death Eaters. Moments later, the Death Eaters stopped casting curses and slowed in midair, swatting at the threads that now ensnared them like far nastier spider webs. Moments later, Hermione and Mrs. Clark were in the cloud. They were safe. At least for the moment. Hermione leveled the broom out and took a moment to catch her breath. They had to be a good 10 miles from the coast still, and she had no illusions that they wouldn't have to fight any other Death Eaters. But with luck, she might be able to hit them from above and behind from here. It wouldn't be easy. Brooms were charmed against most jinxes and hexes, so she wouldn't be able to take out the brooms themselves without high-powered curses. Likewise, neither would the Death Eaters, but that mattered little when they had no compunctions about using the killing curse. Hermione turned back and dove out of the cloud behind where the Death Eaters were, but she was off. They were nearly on top of them, and the Death Eaters were ready, already turning in their direction. They'd never be able to survive that crossfire. Hermione reacted on instinct. Shield raised in front of her face, she charged them. "Strobos!" she cast. A strobe light charm lit up the sky, and the Death Eaters shouted in surprise. She swerved before they could get their bearings again, then dodged the blind curse the Death Eater on her right threw at her and cast Carnifex at him in a wide arc as they passed. There was a crack of the curse cleaving through bone, and a scream as the Death Eater fell off his broom. Mrs. Clark looked back over her shoulder in horror. "Did you just—" Dong! Hermione's shield rang like a gong, despite not being metal, and one of the slats that made it up broke off as it was hit by a dark curse from the other Death Eater. She spun to face him and was horrified to see 3 Death Eaters bearing down on them. A flash of green! She dodged, but she knew she wouldn't be able to stay out of the line of fire for long. And then a flurry of hexes descended from above like bolts from heaven, knocking the Death Eaters out of the way. She looked up and cheered. The cavalry was here. Angelina Johnson, Alicia Spinnet, and Katie Bell were speeding in on their top-shelf brooms, diving into the battle like a squadron of avenging angels. "Thank Merlin!" Hermione shouted to them while she cast a string of hexes at the nearest Death Eater. The 3 girls split off, 2 of them swooping in to make a pincher around the enemy flyers while Katie flew up alongside her. "Heard you could use some help," she called. "Could we ever? We have to help Harry and the twins." The rest of the fight was laid out like a triangle speeding through the air. Flashes of light marked where the skirmishes were taking place. Harry seemed to be mostly left alone. The twins were having a rough time of it, but from the lights she saw peppering the sky, another trio of brooms had joined the fight on the side of the Order. Faced with equal numbers now, and superior flyers, the Death Eaters began to back away. Hermione and Katie flew into the fray, taking pot shots at any black robe that got too close. She was stunned when she came close enough to see the other newcomers. Cedric Diggory, Oliver Wood, and Rebecca Gamp, all fighting fiercely to get them through the attackers. There was just enough light that she could see the coast now, the edge of the land where the cliffs of Dover stood, only a couple of miles distant. Only 10 or 12 miles to French airspace. If they could get there, the Death Eaters would be much learier about following, and the Clarks could request asylum. Their luck didn't hold. A sudden gust of wind hit them, so powerful that it sent all of the riders tumbling. Mrs. Clark clung to Hermione's waist. A scream rang out that she recognized as Harry's, followed shortly after by several others, and when she righted herself, she saw why. It was You-Know-Who himself, the Dark Lord, his loose black robe billowing in the gale, flying without the aid of any broomstick.
"That's impossible," Hermione breathed.
"What?" Mrs. Clark said. But there was no time to answer. You-Know-Who was doing something, and it was putting him at the center of a storm. The wind howled, rain lashed, and lightning exploded around them. How much power was that? The squall was tiny, a couple 100 yards wide at most, just enough to keep Harry trapped. But the amount of force it delivered must be astronomical. Chaos surrounded them.
"Harry!"
"It's him! Run! Help him!" Cedric pulled back, unable to keep control with his prosthetic arm. A flash of lightning struck so close that Hermione was momentarily blinded and deafened. A gust of wind knocked Angelina off her broom.
"Angie!"
Fred screamed, and dove after his girlfriend. Harry was dodging You-Know-Who's curses, blocking some of them by hitting them in flight better than even Hermione thought he could aim. But there was no way his luck could hold out for long. Hermione created more carbon nanofibers, thicker this time, thick enough to cut, directing them at You-Know-Who. The Dark Lord flailed for a moment, a split second that gave Harry time to dive, piling on the speed his firebolt was so famous for. Then You-Know-Who cast a fire charm and burned them out of the air instantly.
"Uh-oh,"
Hermione said. You-Know-Who didn't come for her. Instead, the wind slammed into her and Mrs. Clark, hitting hard from all sides. The greatest storm in Hermione's lifetime was the Great Storm of 1987, which recorded sustained winds of 85 miles per hour over much of southern Britain. Good brooms could fly faster than this, and thus could hold up to such forces, but she was certain this was worse than that storm, and brooms were not intended to take this in a crosswind. The broomstick snapped in two. Hermione screamed as she and Mrs. Clark went tumbling away from each other. Wind and rain still lashed at her as she spun through the air, losing all orientation. She caught a glimpse of the woman spinning away, still stuck to the back half of the broomstick.
"Accio!"
Hermione thought, and she and Mrs. Clark flew towards each other. The impact knocked the wind out of both of them, but Hermione wrapped her arms around her and got a firm grip. Harry was still diving, trying to reach them, but it was no good. His broom couldn't support 4 people, and even if it could, it would slow him down, fatally. As much as she hated to admit it, she was useless to him like this. When she tried to twist herself a bit, she could feel the resistance to her magic, blocking her from apparating with the relative velocity, giving her a crude sense of her airspeed. She couldn't reach the ground safely, and she couldn't afford to wait to fall close enough to use arresto momentum. The Death Eaters would pick her off. Plan C, then.
"Breathe out!"
she yelled to Mrs. Clark.
"What?"
She took advantage of the woman's exhalation to put her self-study to good use. She apparated them 10,000 feet straight up. The sudden change in air pressure made Hermione's ears pop painfully, and she coughed as the air was ripped from her lungs. But the air was clear. They were above the storm, above the clouds. They were still falling. Mrs. Clark was screaming. It took Hermione a moment to realize she was, too. She could apparate them vertically again, but that was risky, and it would be riskier getting them down to the ground, much less getting to the French side of the border.
"What are you doing?"
Mrs. Clark cried, clinging to her.
"Saving our arses!"
What could she do? Apparating across the border would trip the runestone networks of both countries, and could get her in legitimate trouble with the French ministry under various treaties. From there, it was a short step to being handed over to you-know-who's puppet ministry. Kingsley had made very certain she understood that. She couldn't see where the border was, and she was fresh out of brooms. She could just make out the night lights of Callus on the horizon. Could she eyeball it? She'd have to try. She picked a spot that looked to be a quarter of the way across the channel and several thousand feet higher, and with a great effort, she apparated again. Still falling, she hoped she'd judged correctly. Using a wind charm to control their fall, Hermione quickly surveyed the horizon. They were over the open water, clearly still on the English side. She didn't know how much further she could go. Could they land in the water and swim for it? Or could she conjure a boat? It didn't look like they had much other choice. She let them fall. It took about a minute to fall from that height at terminal velocity. This was especially difficult because of the low light and only having the waves to gauge her altitude. Mrs. Clark began to panic. "Stop! Stop! You have to stop!" she cried, pounding on Hermione's back. Hermione fired red sparks of distress down towards the water, exploding like a firework near the surface. If the Death Eaters were close enough to home in on it, they were doomed anyway. 1,000 feet, probably. She used the wind charm to slow their descent, then pulled her second wand and fired another spark. Too fast, too close. "Arresto momentum!" she shouted, and they slowed further. They were down to a safe speed, dropping the last few hundred feet to the water, when Hermione felt a yank on her robes and jerked upward. She nearly lost her hold on Mrs. Clark, but she held fast. To her astonishment, a rope appeared in their face. They both grabbed it. They looked up and saw a massive winged form flying overhead, pulling the rope along. An Abraxan. The two women were pulled up by the rope onto a platform on the back of the elephantine winged horse, where they tumbled to the deck, barely able to grab the handholds to stay themselves against the wind. Mrs. Clark was frozen with shock, but Hermione was alert at once, ready to see whether their rescuers were friend or foe. "Miss Granger, I'm very happy to see you are all right," a French-accented voice said. Hermione's eyes widened. "Monsieur and Madame Delacour?" she said. Fleur's parents nodded and helped her into the vaguely chair-like harness alongside them. "Oui, Fleur sent a message that you needed help," Mr. Delacour said. "Are there others?" "Fleur. Harry's ring connected to Bill and Fleur." "Yes, but—" She surveyed the white cliffs in front of them, all she could see of the English coast in the fading light. "But they'll be miles away by now. We agreed to meet on the breakwater at Callus if we got separated." Mr. Delacour sighed. "Very well," he said. "Tournez la à tour." Mrs. Delacour pulled on the reins, and the great beast turned in mid-air, flying towards the French coast. "My family!" Mrs. Clark said. She tried to leap to her feet. Hermione grabbed her arm and held her so she wouldn't be blown off the Abraxan. "If they made it, they'll meet us at Callus," she said. "If they made it?" "There's nothing we can do from here," she insisted. "I know the boys. They're good at this. All of them are much better flyers than I am." The woman slumped. Hermione could understand how powerless she was feeling. About 20 minutes after they turned around, they landed on the breakwater at Callus, Mr. and Mrs. Delacour and Hermione all working together to keep the Abraxan concealed. It had been a loaner from Beauxbatons, and Madame Maxine would be around to pick it up later. No one was there when they landed, and Hermione's heart sank into her stomach. The brooms were faster than the Abraxan. Had something happened to them? To all of them? It was dark enough now that she couldn't see anyone approach until they were nearly on top of them. When 3 brooms came in for a landing, she readied her wand, but it was Fred, flanked by Katie and Alicia. He landed on the breakwater heavily and stumbled as his broom gave out from under him. Angelina was clinging to his back, and in front of him he held the still unconscious 4-year-old boy. "Geoffrey!" Mrs. Clark cried. She ran to him and caught him up in her arms, hugging him close. Fred fished in his pockets for the antidote to the fainting fancy to wake him up. "Fred, thank God you're all right!" Hermione said.
"Where's George and Harry?"
"Dunno," he grunted. "We got separated. Last I saw, Harry was running from you-know-who. We had too much dead weight to help. No offense, Angie. We barely got out of there. Is that Flora's parents?" Hermione nodded absently. She bit her lip, watching the sky for any sign of her best friend and her boyfriend. It was another few minutes before Mrs. Delacour spotted the next group. Just the two brooms descended and landed on the breakwater this time. George was on one, looking shell-shocked, holding a crying Madeline to his chest. He set her gently on the ground, and she rejoined her mother. On the other broom was Cedric, who was holding Rebecca Gamp up to his chest with his prosthetic arm. He hit the ground hard, and she tumbled off into the gravel, groaning. Her robes were torn, and she was bleeding from multiple gashes.
"Rebecca!"
Hermione rushed to the girl's side, quickly followed by Alicia. They did their best to bind up her wounds, but they could tell she would need a hospital. Looking lower, they saw she had large splinters in her thighs. She was lucky they hadn't hit a major artery.
"What happened?"
Hermione asked as they worked. "Took a few curses, and her broom got blown up right under her," Cedric answered. His hands were shaking, even his artificial one. "Barely caught her before she fell to the ground." George's mouth worked for a minute, no sound coming out. "Oliver's dead," he said. The rest of the former Gryffindor Quidditch team reacted in horror.
"What? No! How?"
Killing curse. All those years dodging bludgers, and it still wasn't enough."
"Oh, George!"
Once Hermione was sure Rebecca was stable, she stood and hugged him tight.
"I'm sorry," she muttered. "What's the situation?"
Two Death Eaters dead for sure, including the one you got," he said. "Another one fell off his broom, but he still had his wand. Oliver, and I don't know where Harry is. Didn't see him after he dove away from you-know-who."
"And my husband?"
Mrs. Clark asked. "Still with Harry last I saw them." Hermione shook as she stood, watching the skies again as she tried not to cry. She had to believe Harry was still okay. If you-know-who got him, all of this was for nothing. She fidgeted, itching for something to do, something to convince herself things were still close to fine. She turned around.
"Keep doing what you came here to do,"
she thought. It was the only thing she could think of right now.
"Excuse me, Mrs. Clark," she said. "There's something I need to do while you're here. Something that will help us fight the man who did this."
The Muggle woman looked at her in confusion.
"I need to get a special magical scan of you, that's all." "What for?" "I can't tell you the details. A baseline for comparison in a magical experiment I'm doing. It's not dangerous or harmful, but it is important. I was hoping to have more time, but this will have to do."
Mrs. Clark looked around at the assembled faces. Most of them were bemused, but Fred and George nodded to her in agreement. She sighed and stepped forward.
"All right,"
she said.
"Fred, George?"
Hermione asked. The twins stepped around her, again shielding her from the view of most of the crowd.
"Now, this may be a little uncomfortable,"
she said. She waved her wand over the woman and whispered, "Atma Prakata." Mrs. Clark sucked in a breath and stared as though transfixed. Then her aura appeared, as bright and colorful as any witch's or wizard's. The predominant color for her was amber, with swirls of earth tones mixed in. The light moved calmly, not roiling with fear or anger. This was her soul stripped bare of those transient things so that only her true nature showed through. Like showing the climate and not the weather. She could probably detect depression, but not sadness. Sociopathy, but not hate. At her best guess, Mrs. Clark seemed mentally healthy. Hermione lowered her wand. That answered that. Her whole plan to study a Muggle's aura in detail was moot. It was the same as a witch's. She was definitely detecting soul, in some respect, and not magic. She'd have to figure out the rest on her own.
"What was that?"
Mrs. Clark asked, shrinking back.
"Probably best if you don't know, but I promise I didn't do anything to you. I just—"
She was interrupted by a light approaching from across the water. purest silver and coming at them fast. She knew she ought to raise her wand to defend herself from a potential attack, but she felt so calm upon seeing the light that she couldn't bring herself to do it. A moment later she understood why, and paradoxically, her anxiety spiked. It was a Patronus. That wasn't what she was expecting. Moments later a shining silver stag stood before them. It opened its mouth and spoke with Harry's voice. "Hermione, I'm back at our headquarters. I reckon if you're not in a safe place by now it doesn't matter. I'm okay mostly, but Mr. Clark, he didn't make it. We were hit by lightning by you-know-who. He got the full force of it because he was behind me. I would have come to you, but I lost the firebolt. It was on fire, and I barely made it to the ground in one piece. You-know-who was still there, and I had to apparate away. I hope you're okay. Tell Mrs. Clark I'm sorry, will you?" The stag vanished, and Hermione turned, ashen-faced, to Mrs. Clark. The woman stood stock-still, staring at her, tears running down her face and her 2 sobbing children clinging to her legs.
"You,"
she cried, in anguish more than fury.
"You said you'd keep us safe!"
She stumbled forward, but Mrs. Delacour was there by her side, gently holding her there. Hermione's voice wouldn't work for a minute. All she could manage was,
"I know." "You said you were protecting us from them," she wailed. "Your friend didn't even come back to us. He left him."
"No!" Hermione snapped, surprising even herself with how angry she sounded.
"Don't you dare blame Harry for this. I'm the one who asked him to take on this mission when we normally wouldn't. That's on me." "And that when Harry is supposed to be the battlefield commander," Hermione supplied. "Look, if we hadn't come to you, one of your children would have done accidental magic sooner or later, and you'd all be dead. If we'd sent someone else, there's a good chance one of your children still would have done magic, and it might have gone better or worse, but that doesn't change the fact that I should have known that you-know-who, that evil wizard, would come in person if he found out Harry was there."
"Not just you, Hermione," George said. "All of us, including Harry."
"Fine," she grumbled. "But I made the call that this mission needed to be done, and needed to be done this way, for reasons that in retrospect seem pretty thin. If you want to be angry at someone, be angry at me."
Mrs. Clark stared at her. Hermione braced herself, preparing for her to shout and scream at her. She'd defend herself if she had to, but she wouldn't stop her from venting at her, if it would help her at all. But instead, the woman lowered her head and wouldn't even look at her. Just go," she said. Hermione nodded.
"All right."
She unloaded their luggage from their handbag, still intact.
"Monsieur and Madame Delacour, could you see that they get somewhere safe?"
They nodded, and she started walking along the breakwater. "Hermione," George said, reaching out to her. She started to brush him away, but he pulled her close, and she let him put his arm around her.
"Let's just go," she muttered.
The other Order members flew back to England on brooms, going the long way around, away from Dover, to avoid any lingering Death Eaters. But Hermione, George, and Fred took a cab to the train station and took the Eurostar back to England, riding it into Ebbsfleet before apparating back to Nottingham, not risking the Ashford or London stations, even in the Muggle world. Hermione clung to George without speaking the whole way back.